So my head is full of little birds at the moment. It's spring and I'm watching them out of my studio window. So I thought I would do this lovely little sparrow on a 15 centimetre wooden block that I've prepared with 3 layers of watercolour ground. And watercolour ground basically makes the surface slightly absorbent so that you can use it a bit like paper. The manufacturers say that it makes it like an absorbent paper surface, and frankly it doesn't. It's similar but different. So don't use this stuff expecting it to be like a wonderful watercolour paper. It's just not, but it's brilliant fun to work with. So I'm going to do this little sparrow in pen and wash, and I was just starting with the eye, and even permanent fine liners like these, that's just a unipin one, actually move a little on this watercolour surface, which obviously you wouldn't get if you were working on paper. So you can put some fine details down and then move it around a little with water to get lovely tonal variations, which is great fun to do. So I've started with the eye, and to be honest, I usually start any animal or bird painting with the eye on the grounds that if you muck up the eyes, you've probably mucked up the entire painting. So you might as well do it at the beginning rather than the end. And then I'm going to come down to the beak, which is really foreshortened. And you've sort of got a triangle underneath, and then sort of the mouth line, and it sort of comes down. It's got such an amazingly quizzical look to it, this little sparrow. I love the sort of jaunty angle. So I just thought it'd be rather fun to do. And then I'm using some waterproof Indian ink to put in the dark areas. So really I'm doing a tonal study, and then once it's dry I'm going to add some watercolour washes just to bring it to life a little. And it's just a very quick little piece, and if I feel like it I may put some gold leaf on it. I love putting gold leaf on studies of everyday animals because I think we should celebrate them because they're so beautiful. Little birds that we sort of overlook, animals that we take for granted. So by sort of decorating them with gold leaf, it sort of says something about how important they are and how beautiful they are. So I'm letting that ink just run down there. And I love the way Indian ink moves on this watercolour ground paper, surface. It really moves with a total life of its own. Just get these little marks around here. And then that cheeky little tail. Getting those hard sort of flight feathers. Let's have a bit of fun down on this leg. I don't know if you've ever looked at birds' legs, but if you do, you can see how in evolutionary terms they just came from the dinosaurs and related to the reptiles, because they're really scaly and really quite ugly. Again, this is really foreshortened. They've got good claws as well. We used to keep chickens, and one of the ailments that they can get is scaly leg, and little parasites get under each scale and lift it, and you have to catch the chickens and apply Vaseline all over their legs, which then sort of suffocates the parasites. But you know, a chicken does not particularly want to have its legs doused in Vaseline, so you end up just getting utterly covered in the stuff too, and there's a lot of squawking and feathers flying and etc, etc. Joys. We haven't got chickens at the moment, sadly. I do miss them, but I don't miss scaly legs. That's a little bit heavy. So the really good thing about watercolour ground is that you can lift very, very easily. You know, if you're on paper and you put too much ink on, kind of be tough, but on watercolour ground you've got half a chance of just lifting it off. So if you haven't used watercolour ground before, do have a look at it. Daniel Smith's, Schminker and Quor make different grounds. They're all a little bit different, but they work in the same way, and you can even make your own. I'll put a link to a recipe and how to prepare a little wooden panel, because I've got some YouTube videos about that, so that might be helpful. I'm just spreading some of this ink down here, and I'm going to come back to this tail. We've got, just come back to some feathers here. Around there. I'm looking at the sort of tonal variations and just seeing what's going on. See, look how that spreads beautifully through. What I like to do as well is just sprinkle a little salt into that ink wash, because again on the wooden panel, the salt produces lovely marks, which is just perfect for the downy feathers. Really nice. So there's our cheeky little chap. I don't think he needs an awful lot more than this, maybe some more detail, just showing where those feathers are in the tail, because they're quite hard. Maybe the end of that is a bit wet, so it's not doing very well. Let's put a bit more dark there. But because I'm planning on putting a gold background on, and I am going to do that, I have decided, I can't soften off the edges in the way that I would like to, because I'd like to give them real sort of fluff, but just can't do that because of the process with the gold, which you'll see in a moment. Right, we'll let that dry and come back to it. So our little bird has dried, and it's a good idea to use this opportunity just to adjust any ink that's maybe not quite as dark as you want. Get rid of any pencil lines you don't fancy, and just give a little spruce up to make sure it's what you're after. So I'm just going to make that a bit more beaky. You could do this with your brush or as I'm doing here with pen, just depending what you need to sort out. Look really hard at what you're doing, because sometimes you can just assume that you've drawn something right or painted something right, and then you look at it and think, oh, what's going on there then? So I want to make these little bits a little bit finer, the edges of this black area, just to give the impression that there's a bit more detail than I've actually done. You can also, of course, get rid of the salt, and look at the lovely texture it's given me. So let's get rid of that salt. I don't think I've quite got the shape round there right, but luckily, because I'm going to put in a gold background, I can sort that out. No, it's not disastrous, it's just not quite right. So I'm going to put in a few more dark marks around there. So it's to imply detail that really isn't here. Human eye is brilliant, because if it sees a tiny bit of detail, it assumes that you've put the rest in, and I totally haven't, because, well, I just didn't want to. Obviously you don't want to do too much, because we just want this to be kind of simple and charming. That's what we're aiming for. Right, and then we're going to add a little bit of colour. I've got a tiny watercolour set, which is Derwent Inktense, with a few extra colours in because it didn't have entirely what I wanted. And I'm just going to use a little brush. Gosh, I don't usually use anything this small. I've pre-wet it, as you just saw me do there, just so the colours release nicely. And I'm using a little bit of burnt sienna to bring in the wings. There's the feathers, and then there's a little down to the tail. The top of his head, its head, is quite an interesting brown, sort of slightly different, sort of almost got a bit of purple going on in it, and then got some nice soft colours. And the great thing is that our ink is waterproof, so doesn't move, because if you end up using watercolour ground, what you will find is that layering is very tricky. The paint tends to lift, but if you use a waterproof ink, then you don't have that problem, which is fab. Now I've got very limited colours in that little palette, as you could see, so I'm just going to have to improvise, and that's a bit red for its legs. But I'll lift some of that colour off and it'll be okay. And we know that watercolour tends to dry a little bit lighter, so even though that red is too much, I think we'll be okay. Might be fun to put in a bit of yellow just to capture a little bit of light. Just a little bit of interest. Need a bit of colour. So when you're doing line and wash, I always say try and go for a 2 and 2 = 5 situation. People sometimes ask what on earth I mean by that. I think it's obvious, but apparently it's not. What I mean is try and get the ink and the watercolour to add up to more than the sum of their parts. So rather than just colouring in the painting, the drawing even, or if you did paint first, just outlining your painting, aim that the watercolour and the painting together sort of is a little bit more. So maybe you'll go outside the lines, maybe you'll leave more white space. And I think I am going to just lift a little bit. I'm just using a bit of magic eraser that's dampened just to soften and lift a little bit of this ink and the watercolour. I've lost too much white here. And I don't think we need much more than that. So we'll let that dry and then we can carry on. The final thing that you might want to do is to put in any missing little highlights. Yeah, you could use like a white ink sort of pen, like a Posca pen, or this is a Koh-i-Noor. You could use some, let's find it, white gouache. Just depends what you've got. A little gel pen is another option. Let's just put in, say, little highlights, say, across the top of the beak. We managed to keep the highlight around the eyes, so that's fine. You know, if you want to put a second one in, you could do it like that. And then maybe just a little highlight across the top of its head. You know, if you thought this had got a bit solid here, you might want to put in some tiny flecks. That's sort of up to you and what's going on in your picture. Just be aware that adding white back in never quite looks as good as if you've managed to retain it, but you know, needs must. I'm just going to put some little highlights to show those scales on the leg. I think those will look quite nice. And maybe just to emphasize the claw, little curve of white there. There we go. That's our little sparrow sorted. And I'm going to put on a gold background. Now, if you don't like gold leaf or you haven't done that, of course you paint the background. And if I was painting the background, I'd have lovely, soft, fluffy edges. But this is gold size. And I'm using a teeny brush to come round and basically paint around my bird. And the good thing about doing it this way is that you can actually do a little bit of surgery if you need to. You can, because wherever we put this glue, then the gold leaf is going to go. So say, as I've made that tail a little bit long, I can just shorten it at this point. So I'm coming round and say over here on this foot where it's gone a bit mushy, the toes have fused together, well, I can separate them again because this is going to be gold leaf. And I've put burnt sienna into my gold leaf, just burnt sienna watercolour, because firstly it makes it so much easier to see where you've gone, but secondly, if any of the gold leaf breaks up over the surface, then this lovely warm burnt sienna colour will glow through and it gives an overall warmer feel to the gold. If the white of the surface shows through, it just looks like you've made a bit of a mistake. So I'm just going to come down carefully to separate that toe, then round those little feathery marks. Now usually I work on way bigger canvases than this, sort of like by a metre, and I just sort of slap the gold size on. So this is quite a novelty to me to use such a tiny brush. And this brush is actually a masking fluid brush. It's not one of my little watercolour brushes, because I don't think the gold size would do it any good whatsoever. I mean, it washes out, it's not like masking fluid, but probably just to be on the safe side, I think it's just use an old brush, and that will be far better. This gold size takes about 15 minutes to dry, depending how thick you've put it on. It's the fastest drying one I could find. It's a Polyvine one. There's all sorts out there. The slower it dries, the smoother you can get the final effect, because all these brush strokes have time to settle out, whereas on this fast drying one you don't. But I have no problem with a little bit of texture beneath my gold leaf, so I'm more an impatient person, so the quick drying is really good for me. Just need to make a decision round the back of this wing. Do you remember I said I thought I hadn't got the shape quite right? So I think I'm just going to cover that up. Do a little wing surgery on our bird. And then I have a decision where the watercolour has actually gone outside of the lines. I actually rather like that, so I'm going to go around carefully and do it like that. Right, I've done all that carefully, so now I can just grab a bigger brush. Let's move that out of the way and cover the rest, because you'll get a far smoother finish with a bigger brush. And I'm going to do the sides as well. Let that dry for 15 minutes. So gold leafing is ever so straightforward. You simply need a piece of gold leaf, and your size needs to have dried to what's called tack. So it's a bit like a post-it note, just a bit sticky. Let's just lay that gold leaf down like that. You can just smooth it over. And I'll just use another piece. Again, just smooth it in place. And then of course we've got the sides. Just need to put the sides. And just smooth it down. And then we just need to make sure it is fully stuck down. This is called burnishing. just check those sides. If you've got any little excess bits, you can use those to patch up anything that you've missed. I'll just do that. And take off any excess like that. These little spare bits are called skewings, and any gaps that you've got are called holidays, which I think is rather lovely. And then let's get that back on there. You can just gently take off the excess with our soft brush. And see what we've got as our image. There we go. And there's our little sparrow. Right, let's look at our little chap. The last thing I would do, as you can see, I did some little flicks of gold size and let those dry, and they take a bit longer to dry. But I might just do a few little flicks of ink, and possibly a couple of little marks just to tie that image together. I'm going to use a syringe with a little bit of ink and do one decent sized splatter, I reckon. And I just use a syringe to place the drop where I want it. There we go. We're done. So when that's dry, I'd need to varnish that, and our little sparrow's finished.